Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the Universal Soldier movie. I say the, but there is no the. So, we're here today to review Universal Soldier. So, going into this movie, I like the fact that, this movie went on to do well enough to keep giving us franchises. If people did not realize, there's actually four of these movies, and we have it to where in the third Universal Soldier movie, Dolph Lundgren does come back. Uh, and then the fourth one just basically straight up just kills the franchise. Just straight up just brutally kills it. Like, I ended up seeing the fourth Universal Soldier movie, and I never want to see that movie again. The movie is honestly 100% not anywhere close what the other movies were. It's just not. But anyways, I do enjoy this one. Really, imagine if we had a bunch of RoboCops in this movie. That's kind of what this movie delivers, is just a bunch of RoboCops going and going after some people. We're literally not having guys in metal endoskeletons or whatever, how RoboCop actually was, but I'm just saying, in movements and how really they were so very much robotic instead of actually very human. We have it to where that's where I would say RoboCop, they kind of move like RoboCop. They have it to where when you shoot through them, it doesn't really matter because they are still going to live through that. Is what the Universal Soldiers do. I would really say that GCVD, Jean-Claude in this movie, is, and I say GCVD or JCVD because that's what Jean-Claude actually likes to be called. So, Jean-Claude, because I know this because I've seen several Jean-Claude movies. Jean-Claude Van Damme. I love Jean-Claude Van Damme. I love how it feels like his movies are different than all the other action movies. The only thing that I kind of get bogged up about is every single time they have to ask him where he's from. Where is that accent from? How is it that you sound like that? Are you French? Is your mother French? Is it whoever, whatever? I need the backstory on that. They ask that every single movie he's in. Every single movie, he's always a... he's always a character that ends up going AWOL from the military, and that always happens in every one of his stories, and that happens a lot, and they always ask him well, hey, where are you from, buddy? Where's that accent from? I want to know. So, but here's the one thing. Dolph Lundgren in this movie is so haunting. I really like Dolph Lundgren in this movie compared to any other film that he's ever been in. Because if in the Rocky movie, you could probably say, well, he's scary in that movie. He's just, I will break you. And he's just this machine. Where in this movie, he really, if Dolph Lundgren could have been Jason Voorhees, he could have easily pulled it off. Because really watching this movie could tell you that Dolph could eventually be a Jason Voorhees because of how just intimidating he really is in this movie, which I thought was fascinating. So, funny enough, we end up having the female lead in this movie being a reporter, and in the sequel movie, The Return, with Bill Goldberg, we end up also having coincidentally, a reporter being Luke Devereaux's love interest in the sequel movie. I'm like, oh yeah, that's interesting. It's like, man, did they really just figure out a way to work that out and just turn that same kind of concept? Funny enough, I was looking in the IMDb through this, and I realized that Michael J. White was actually in this movie as a soldier somewhere. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So it's kind of funny. So Michael J. White was actually in the sequel movie, and so like he was actually in the original too. Wow, that was fascinating. So plus Michael J. White has been in a number of extras in a number of movies. Like if you watched like the guy who I'm talking about is the guy from Spawn and Welcome to Sudden Death, I think. That guy ends up also being an extra in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, which you can kind of see him in the background. It's kind of interesting with a group of other guys. But anyways, Michael J. What or Michael J. Why am I going into that? So, he's in the sequel. That's great. So, anyways, going into here, I kind of like. It seems that this movie was like scripted to the T. It really feels like everyone was really trying to nail a lot of this script, I think, because it kind of feels like nothing else is really important, but all the lines, all the lines that everyone is delivering. Nothing else matters in the background. It's like everyone just can just be like all like, man, I don't really care as long as I'm just saying the lines that I'm delivering and then I'm walking off. It kind of feels like there's some actors that do have a little bit of freedom to just kind of inject whatever they want. But it, because I think there's some characters here and there that kind of like, just like they know or realize that the camera maybe can't exactly hear them because they're far off to the distance or whatever. And so we end up having some characters maybe taking some liberties on certain characters or whatever. But anyways, a bulk of this is all like lined so perfectly to where like it's kind of off-putting how we have it to where like nothing else matters but that one line or that one whatever. And maybe that's just the way of the style that those movies were, where it's just like, well, no, every little thing of a movie in the 80s, I think, had to be quoted eventually somewhere further down the line. And so I think that was just the thing where it's like, hey, we don't care about how things are going to be done in this movie as long as you have some quotable line or something like that that people are going to shout at you for years to come. And so, yeah, I think in the 80s and 90s kind of movies, we end up having it to where the only thing that mattered was getting the lines out. Because eventually it was like, hey, like all we care about is eventually having somebody quote these lines back to you at some point. So going into this, yeah, I enjoy the journey of this movie. It's kind of really interesting. It's kind of fun. And really, this movie is just to eventually get us to, if people want me to review other Universal Soldier movies, like the Bill Goldberg movie, which I think is really a fun movie. I'll even go and review the Universal Soldier, the third movie, whatever that one was. I think it was like Reanimation or something. And then I'm never going to review the fourth one. I just won't. I just stubbornly won't. So let's go into the review of this movie. Yeah. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we end up opening this film on the Hoover Dam of all places, it seems, or some kind of dam somewhere. I could be wrong about that, but I guess when we have a main character called Jean-Claude Van Damme, I guess we have to go with this movie somewhere, right? So we end up having it to where there is a, let's just say, a attack of sorts of this dam. We end up having a group of individuals that are all holding people in this Hoover Dam hostage. And so we end up having supposedly the Universal Soldiers dumped out a mile and a half away from where they are to go and kill all these people. And we have these military guys mentioning where, like, hey, mile and a half, dump them off and whatever. And like all the other normal military people and all the normal like police and whoever is kind of hearing what they're saying, it's like, dude, a mile and a half in like 13 minutes? Are you crazy? Because we have it to where these kidnappers of sorts are killing people one by one within a certain time limit. And so we have it to where we end up having these Universal Soldiers making it to the making it to the dam and up to where the attackers are in pretty decent time, with like 8 seconds slower or whatever. And so we end up having the Colonel Perry kind of complaining like, well, they're 8 seconds slow. It's like, come on. So we end up having the Universal Soldier. So we have, God, what is his name? GR76, who is actually Ralph Moeller. He ends up going in as a seemingly construction worker. And, like, this guy is huge. This guy is muscular as F in his construction working thing. And nobody is the wiser. We have it to where the attackers just bob their heads out, just like, hey, who is that? This big, giant, muscular man. So they end up telling this guy to stop, and of course he doesn't. And so they just light bullets into GR76. Sadly, R.I.P.D., he's dead. We will never see him for the rest of the movie, right? No, that's not true. So we have it to where these attackers light bullets into this guy. And so we end up having both Dolph and Jean-Claude come out of these two openings, and they start firing upon the attackers. And we have GR76, who also takes a gun from out of his toolbox and starts firing away at these guys. And they kill all the attackers, and they're like, yay, they did it. And oh, but that one guy, he had to die though. So we end up having it to where Veronica Roberts is the reporter of this movie. And so she ends up going and wanting to try to get an exclusive or some kind of camera time with these soldiers, with this unit of Universal Soldiers. And she's never gonna get in. No, this is like classified and all kinds of things. Because we have a very beginning sequence where we have Luke Devereaux going in, and this is Vietnam. And so Luke is going in to what is to be Vietnam, and we end up finding Andrew Scott, who is Dolph Lundgren's character. He is going and grabbing these defenseless people, and he is kind of playing with them to basically say, oh, which one's kind of gonna die first, kind of thing. And we have Andrew Scott, who has a necklace full of ears, which obviously tells everybody, yeah, this guy is weird, even though realistically, Norman Reedus did the exact same thing, and nobody's saying anything about him, right? From the Walking Dead show. Like they can't like it's kind of funny how they like merchandise that and whatever. Like, hey guys, do you want an ear on a rope? Whatever. So we end up having Andrew Scott ends up going and putting this necklace of ears, and so we end up having it to where Andrew goes and kills the man, and then eventually we have Luke come in and say, "Hey, uh, hey, Andrew Scott, like, let's go home, uh, this is my last tour, let's go home." And so and that's my Jean-Claude Van Damme impression. Let's go home. Let's go home. Run! 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 Anyways, let's go home. So, as I hit puberty while I was shouting. So, run! Whatever he says in this movie. So, we have it to where, uh, so Luke is telling Andrew, "Hey, like, let's go home. Like, this is my last tour. Let's go home." And so we have it to where Andrew is like, "No, like, I am not letting these pigs like get away with this," and so on and so forth. We got to take all of them out. It's an order. It's an order. And so we end up having it to where Luke won't pull the trigger, and also he will not pull the trigger on his superior because he just wants to go home. And so, and so, so we end up having Andrew deciding that, well, he's going to kill the woman. And so we end up having Luke and Andrew have this small fight out. And while that is going on, we end up having the woman go and run off. And so we end up having it to where Andrew Scott is grabbing a grenade and he's like, "Hey, like, I'm going to go and chuck this grenade at this woman." And so the entire time we're having Luke shouting out, "Run! Run!" as the puberty version of the way I was going to say it. So we have it to where the girl's running, and of course she ends up dying via grenade explosion. And so we end up having it to where there is a gun standoff between Andrew and Luke, which ends up having it to where both fire upon one another and both die. So we end up having it to where we have the military that has decided that every single one of these soldiers are now to be deemed to be missing in action, and that none of this had actually happened, and they're going to fill out none of the reports of any of these people and say that they're all dead or they're all whatever. They're gonna decide to take all these men, put them on ice, and put them into the Universal Soldier program because they are the perfect candidates for this. Like, I guess a lot of things, like, kind of, for maybe the government, kind of like have a little wiggle room to just be like, well, hey, like, we need this experiment, so we're going to get this soldier and experiment on them. And because when looking at it, like, there's some people that need to fire guns, there's some people that need to write paperwork, and there's probably some people also that need to be experimented on because military. Captain America, First Avenger. Anyways, so going on here, so we have these universal soldiers that are all in this big gigantic semi truck esh like thing that has all of these super soldiers in their little cooling pod thing, uh, where they're all sitting in these chairs, all getting air cooling systems like blown into them, and they all have to sit in these chairs to get a needle in their freaking neck, like the Matrix almost. Um, to cool them down because they have to worry a lot about temperature and they can't get too hot. So, excuse me. So, we go on into this movie and they can't go home. And so and so we go on and we have we have these characters that uh, we end up having this reporter and her lackey, her cameraman, trying to sneak into this semi truck thing at night to try to get a sneak peek about these people. And we end up having it to where uh, this reporter and her cameraman end up getting pretty dang close to the point of her snapping photos of one of the Universal soldiers that are in this freezer container of the one guy who had gotten shot up. He is in this container that is to heal all of his bullet holes for him to be fine. And so we have it to the reporter opens up this container with this guy in it, and she takes photos thinking that, oh, this guy is dead, and he gets right back up, and she's like, oh my god. And so we end up having it to where the reporter and the cameraman end up trying to get this photo because we have it to where, like, the way that this truck thing ends up coming into the frame in the first part of this movie is really interesting. We have like a plane that like opens in half, and this big truck ends up coming out of it. And I was like, wow, this is really amazing visual to kind of open up to see how like important like this movie is, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where like this truck thing is awesome looking. But anyway, so we go on, and the porter is realizing that there's some military guys that are kind of coming after her. The Universal soldiers are being awakened to simply go after this reporter and her cameraman, and so they basically end up tracking this girl down and like stopping her. And so here's the thing: we end up having it to where we at first had Luke Devereaux that was showing signs of him stopping what he was doing at some point to remember something. He stopped to remember Vietnam for 1 second, and so we end up having Colonel Perry and all the scientists trying to understand why exactly he had a jogging of memory. And so they end up asking him about it. And before they all went in to go and get their needles into their neck, we had it to where Luke recalls some memory of Vietnam and talking about how bad it was. And they're just like, well, maybe we should pull him out of the program and just kind of like so like every time they want to start pulling somebody out of the program, we have Colonel Perry who's like, no, we're not pulling anybody out of this program. Like, no, we need all the people that we can get. Like, we're not pulling anybody. And so we end up having it to where now uh, Veronica and her reporter are now knees on the ground, hands on their head, and we have GR13, who's Dolph, who goes to uh, ask them like, well, hey, we're gonna need your camera. And so the reporter doesn't want to give up the camera. We end up having the cameraman kind of fidgeting and kind of like, well, hey, no. And so we end up having Andrew Scott accidentally assassinating the cameraman. And we end up having the scientist and the Colonel Perry, they're all freaking out. They're like, hey, no, that they shouldn't have been doing that. And so we end up having Luke going to the defense of this reporter, and so Luke ends up choosing a side, and so he ends up going and decking GR13 to then take Veronica and drive off. And so we eventually have it to where, of course, all the Universal soldiers are going and trying to follow them, but we have it to where it seems that Veronica is starting to lose gas in her car. And so eventually we have it to where Luke ends up going, and by the sheer strength of running as fast as humanly possible, we have Luke just basically pushing this car and running at the same time. So we have it to where like Luke is pushing this vehicle to almost 30, 40, whatever miles an hour just by pushing it and moving his feet as fast as humanly possible. And so we end up having it to where Luke pushes this thing all the way to some hotel. And so we have it to where Luke also had taken a cigarette lighter and put that over his wound that he had. And so while they are going to this hotel, Luke is really going out of his way to complain that he needs ice. He's cold. And so we have it to where Veronica is going and asking for a phone at this hotel, and we have it to where the hotel clerk is saying, well, hey, we have a phone in our in one of our rooms. It's like $50 a night. And so Veronica's like, no, I just need a phone. And so the only way that this girl will get a phone is to rent one of the rooms, and so she does. So we have it to where Luke is saying like, I need to be cold. And so we have it to where she takes him into the room and says, hey, like, they have air conditioning in the room, and so you can be perfectly cold by being in there. And so we have it to where Luke goes and tries to put the air conditioner on like full blast, and he's like desperately trying to like collect every little bit of cold air into the room with his hands, bizarrely. And so we end up having Luke, or Devereaux, who isn't getting cold enough, and so we end up having his arm, his wristband thing, basically telling him that he's heating up too much. And so we have it to where eventually Veronica goes out to uh, go and I think check on something. And we have Luke, who is butt naked, just going out there, just flaunting his twig and berries, and basically saying to Veronica again, it's like, I'm cold. I need to be cold. I have to be cold. And so we have it to where Luke just flops on the ground. And so we end up having it to where Veronica is now scrambling and getting every single pack of ice that she can possibly find and shoves it into this tub, grabs Luke, drags his naked carcass all the way into the tub. And so we end up having Veronica checking on Devereaux, and we end up noticing that that Devereaux's that Devereaux's wound is healing itself, and so we have it to where Veronica is freaking out because she's like, "This does not make sense. How is it that you can run as fast as the wind, basically, and?" And how is it that you can use ice like people use band-aids? This doesn't make sense to me. I'm so confused. And so we have it to where Luke straight up has zero diddly worth of answers to really give Veronica. And so we end up having it to where Veronica is like, dude, I really absolutely need some answers. And so we end up having it to where the Universal Soldiers end up tracking down Devereaux and Veronica. And so we end up having it to where Luke, who is now healed, we have GR13, who is kind of waiting outside the hotel to get orders, and they're like, no, we want both Veronica and Luke in the same room together, and so on and so forth. So they wait it out, and then they eventually see that both of them are in the same room together, and so we end up having these Universal Soldiers just firing bullets into this room like crazily. And so we end up having Devereaux, who goes from room to room to room by just ramming his body through these walls to make it to the next room, to make it to the next room, to make it to the next room. And then eventually they end up hiding within a bed of people that are already laying inside this bed. And we have it to where the Universal Soldiers are like, oh, they must escape somehow. And so they end up going and leaving because I guess the tracking of heat just like, oh, they only saw the two people in the bed, and so that's all they saw. And so they get the slip, and so we end up having the Devereaux and Veronica. They go on to eventually steal this guy's car, and eventually they make their way to this gas station, to where Devereaux now has to ask Veronica, hey, like, I think there's a tracker on me, so, or that sounds like Arnold. There's a tracker on me, so you need to find it. And so we have it to where Jean-Claude strips down yet again to have Veronica try to feel all over Jean-Claude's muscles to see if there's something that doesn't feel right. And we have it to where Veronica notices some bizarre thing on Luke's calf muscle. And so Devereaux says, we'll cut it out. And so she says, well, no, like, I'm not going to cut it out. And so he cuts it out himself. And then Veronica still needs to pull the thing out. And she's like, oh, this is awful. And so she asks him, it's like, well, like, does this hurt? And he's like, no. And so we end up having it to where Luke ends up changing clothes with the gas station attendant, and uh, Luke ends up going into the he ends up going into the trunk of the cars that are parked out front. All the gas station attendant, Veronica, and Luke all go into the trunks of the cars that are parked out front. They all have ice packs within them, and so on and so forth. So we have the Universal soldiers that track down this gas station, and go into this gas station and shoot it full of bullet holes. But when they accidentally do that, they also end up hitting a thing of gas that was poured into this gas station, which trickles out onto the gas pumps, which explodes this entire gas station, which ends up having all of the guys, the scientists and military people that were in said bus, or in said semi-universal soldier truck thing, they all come out to go and try to save their soldiers, their specimens, by going and spraying all kinds of coolant and stuff like that. And so while they're doing that, Luke and Veronica end up going into the soldier truck, and they end up going and trying to scramble to get all the information on this experiment that they can possibly get, and then run like heck out of there to eventually drive off in a vehicle, and so on and so forth. So we end up having these two characters going and going to some diner where Veronica is starting to go through these 3-ring binders about all this information. And so we end up having it to where Luke is thinking like, oh, well, maybe we'll get answers out of this, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where Veronica goes to try to find, I think, a phone again to try to call somebody, and we end up having it to where Luke ends up just ordering endless amounts of food, and then eventually gets to the point to where the Brenda, the waitress Brenda, she starts asking Luke, well, hey, are you going to have some money for this? Are you going to have some money for the, for the food? And so we have it to where Luke says absolutely nothing. And so the cook ends up coming back from the back, and he's like, hey, man, like, I spent all day cooking up that slop. And so, like, are you going to have money for that slop? And so we have it to where Luke says, well, it's good food. And so we end up having the chef who is now going to try and fight Luke. And Luke just goes ahead and just kicks the crap out of this guy to where he goes flying into this table and crashing through that. And so we end up having all these people, all these guys at this diner going ahead and trying to fight Luke. And we end up having this moment where Luke ends up like attacking this guy into this jukebox, and so the jukebox ended up going from one thing of music to the other, and so Luke continues to just keep fighting people, and he's consistently telling people it's like, hey, I don't want trouble, I just want food, kind of thing. And so like it's kind of like the Jackie Chan moment in Rush Hour where Jackie Chan is with all those guys in the pool hall, and he's like, I don't want trouble. I just like I don't want trouble. And so they end up like trying to take Jackie Chan down, and Jackie Chan ends up using like pool cues and all kinds of things to just beat the living crap out of all these people. Uh, but it's kind of the same scene, kind of like that, and so we end up having Veronica and Luke just getting the heck out of this restaurant, and so on we go to find out that Devereaux had a doctor that had worked on him, that had made him this universal soldier. So we end up having Veronica and Devereaux going to Dr. Christopher Gregor, and so we end up having Devereaux going to this doctor, and Veronica goes out to talk to him. And while Devereaux is just kind of seeing if this guy is a familiar face to him, when Dr. Christopher Gregor turns around to look at Devereaux, Devereaux remembers him because at some point in the middle of this surgery that Devereaux had had in the past, we end up finding that Christopher Gregor was the only doctor out of all 800 of these doctors to put down his doctor's mask to look at Devereaux, and really that's all that Devereaux actually does remember. And so we end up having it to where Veronica is to talk to this doctor, kind of do a little bit of catch up, try to help us understand who Devereaux really is, and like where he is to go back home to, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where it seems that Veronica and Devereaux have become two people on the run. And so we end up having it to where the next step is to decide to have Devereaux try to go back home, while Veronica is to, I guess, go and try to get this story. Devereaux is to decide to go back home. And so while Devereaux is trying to get a bus ticket to go back home, we have it to where that's when the people end up grabbing both Veronica and Devereaux, and putting them into a prison bus, because they're going off to go to prison now. And so because we end up having Veronica is like, dude, I'm gonna see this story all the way through, and if that ends up having me be in prison, then so be it. So while that is going on, we have it to where Andrew Scott is now starting to remember bits and pieces of his past, to where eventually when Colonel Perry is to call Andrew Scott GR13, GR13 does not respond, and he's like, "My name is Andrew Scott. I must break you." So that's not what he says, but man, would that be funny if that line just kind of carried through every movie that he did. But anyways, he's like, "My name is Andrew Scott," and so with the less Russian accent. So we have to where Andrew is now starting to be very defiant, and we have it to where at some point Colonel Perry is telling him to go back into the bus with all the other Universal soldiers, and Andrew Scott just disregards that order. And so Colonel Perry is just getting frustrated with this guy, and Andrew Scott ends up shooting Colonel Perry in the eye and killing him. And so we end up having Andrew Scott basically saying, well, from here on out, like, I am going to be like the commander of this. Because we end up having it when uh, we end up having it to where uh, both uh, there's two super soldiers that end up going and end up getting blown up. And so we, because we have it to where, and there's a whole lot of story that I'm kind of backpedaling on now. We have Andrew Scott that had killed Perry, and so one by one, we eventually have the other scientists that are starting to say, "Well, hey man, like I'm not gonna get in control by Andrew Scott because Andrew Scott is just pumping in a bunch of like steroids and kind of muscle enhancement things into his body, and this isn't right." And so we end up having it to where one of the scientists who is Woodward tells GR13, "Hey man, you're running a little hot," and so Andrew Scott is realizing, you know what, you're right, and so we have Andrew Scott that goes into goes into his cooling tank thing, and we have Woodward and we have the other scientist, which I think his name is Garth. I don't know. Um, we have them talking back and forth of like, well, how are we going to be able to kill him? And so we end up having Woodward saying like, well, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to give him the injection that's going to kill him. And the other scientist is like, no, I think it'll look better if I do it. So the other scientist ends up going in and he mentions that there's some chair malfunction and Andrew isn't buying it. So he ends up taking the scientist and saying, well, here, like, how about we test it on you? And so we have the needle going all the way through this guy's face and killing him. And so we end up having Woodward, who uh, goes and eventually gives a grenade to GR76 and tells him to hold it for 30 seconds. And so GR76 ends up taking the grenade and Woodward's hand, and he won't let go of both. And so we end up having this bus completely explode, and so Andrew Scott is dragging his Universal soldiers into a grocery store that has a cooler in the back or a freezer in the back, and so we have it to where now Andrew Scott is completely off of his lid and basically having post-traumatic flashbacks of Vietnam, and so everything is basically Vietnam to him. And so like he's basically declaring that they're at war and everybody's at war, and so he's talking to everybody, I guess trying to uh, talk to them to be on his cause, but nobody is. So Andrew Scott just walks off with what is left of his Universal soldiers. And so we end up having it to where uh, that so we now reassess this movie and have uh, Devereaux and Veronica in this bus going to what we were to be assumed prison at some point or some other. I don't know. This scene is very bizarre to have this being done on a bus because of like, shouldn't they have gotten like prison fatigues or whatever? Shouldn't they have like gone to a sheriff's department or something instead of just being tossed onto this bus. Doesn't quite make sense, but it is what it is. So we end up having it to where they're going along on this bus, and so we slowly but surely see the Universal Soldier bus thing going and ramming this bus to the point of basically putting bullet holes through all the way through this bus and eventually going and killing the driver of this bus to where Dolph is telling Jean-Claude to go and check his driver because this driver is just all over the place. He's a horrible driver, this bus is, because this guy is dying. So we end up having it to where luckily there is just some little wire or something that Devereaux pulls out of this bus, this part of this bus seat, and he ends up having the perfect device to be able to get this door open and then eventually go to take control of this said bus. And while that's going on, we have Andrew, who is tossing in grenades into this bus saying, hey, you want to play a game? And so we end up having Veronica trying to figure out where these grenades are and grabbing the grenades and tossing them back out of the bus. And so there's like this back and forth cat and mouse thing going on with the grenades in the bus, and every single grenade ends up being tossed out of this bus by Veronica and they go off. And so eventually we have it to where Andrew ends up tossing the grenades and it's just kind of hitting the bus now and so on and so forth. So eventually it just gets to the point to where Devereaux decides that both him and Veronica are going to jump out of this bus. And they're going to perfectly time it to where they're going to go off to the edge of this cliff. And Veronica and him are going to jump off. And so we have it to where the bus doors open and Devereaux pushes Veronica out of the bus to where Devereaux keeps on driving. And so we end up having it to where Andrew Scott is realizing what Devereaux is doing, and so we end up having it to where Andrew Scott tries to stop Devereaux from trying to do this, and so we end up having this bus just topple over to where reasonably the soldier truck ends up deciding to just ram the bus off this cliff. And so we have Devereaux who pops his head out of this bus to shoot the GR-76 from really ramming this bus. And so GR-76 consistently has his foot on the gas pedal to where Andrew Scott is like, oh my god, no! And so we have it to where Devereaux's bus and the Universal Soldier bus both go off this cliff, while Devereaux ended up just kind of running off this bus and jumping off of the bus, and he's perfectly fine. We have it to where Andrew and all the buses and whatever end up going and all get brutally and horribly destroyed. We are to assume all the Universal Soldiers are all dead and happy ending, right? No. So we end up having it to where Devereaux is to just go home. He goes to go and find his parents and reconnect with them, and we end up finding out that evidently Devereaux's mother speaks French, and so that's the connection, I guess. So we end up having this family having to get together. Everything's all fine and dandy. Veronica goes out to go for a smoke because she's a smoker, and we have it to where consistently Veronica is talking about smoking, and we have it to where Luke is telling her, it's like, hey, you'll die if you smoke, so on and so forth, like these could kill you, and blah, blah, blah. So we end up having Veronica going out, I think, for a smoke and to drive off and whatever. And so we have it to where Dolph stops her, pulls her out of the vehicle, and says, like, hey, like, nice seeing you again. So we end up having it to where, quite obviously, Dolph has taken some massive, just massive needles into his body at this point. And so we keep having him just keep popping these needles into his body and so on and so forth because they're giant needles and whatever. So we end up having it to where now Luke is being called out by Andrew. We have it to where Andrew has taken Veronica and both Luke's parents and all tied them up into this barn to basically tell Devereaux, like, hey, come for me, come on. And so we end up having it to where Luke eventually is to go, of course, to fight Andrew, but really he just kind of outmatched power-wise. Like, Luke is just being flung around and like being like picked up and then just chucked like he's a sack of potatoes. And we have it to where Dolph is like smashing Devereaux into this car and so on and so forth, to eventually Luke just cannot take it, and so he ends up grabbing one of the needles from Andrew's vest, and he ends up taking one of the needles. And so, like, it's not quite evenly matched, but it's a little bit quasi there. And so we eventually have Veronica, who is trying to untie her own knots by trying to cut them off. And so eventually when Veronica does cut them off, she goes off running. And so we end up having this replay the scenario of Vietnam where Andrew is going like, oh, well, she's running off? Well, I have a grenade here, and I'm going to go and chuck it after her. And we end up having the otherwise exhausted Jean-Claude saying, again for this girl, it's like, run, run! And so we end up having her, of course, run, and Dolph ends up tossing the grenade, and we are to assume that Veronica is dead. And now, Devereaux, if he was just kind of like, well, I guess I could really just see, like, my mom and dad maybe dying off, and I don't know about this Veronica girl quite all that much, but I don't know. It's a lukewarm kind of feeling whether all these people should really just live or die or not. I'm not sure. But eventually, when Andrew recreates that whole Vietnam scene all over again, that's when Devereaux just gets 10 levels of ticked off. And so we have it to where now Devereaux has his game face on, and he is just kicking the crap out of Andrew, back and forth, kicks here and there, all over the gosh darn place, and to eventually to where Andrew ends up falling onto this, the back of this, or some part of this, like, wood chipper or something along those lines, where he just gets like spikes all the way throughout his entire body, I guess, from this like wood chipper, and this bizarrish wood chipper looking thing where it's like spiky and whatever. And so we end up having it to where, like, Devereaux thinks that Andrew is dead from that, but no. Andrew ends up grabbing the arm that's free and dragging uh, Devereaux closer to him so he can kind of spike Devereaux's head into one of these spikes. And so we end up having Devereaux grabbing the one arm that's free of Andrew and breaking it, and then he ends up going off to the side to turn on this chipper to tell Andrew it's uh, like uh, like something about like sayonara Sarge or something like that, or something Sarge. It's a rhyming silly thing, but that ends up like he I don't know what the heck he says, but right after that he turns on the chipper, and then uh, and Andrew ends up going shipped away and dies, and so we end up having it to where Devereaux goes and checks on Veronica for her to be hurt but not exactly killed, which of course we gotta have a happy ending. And then eventually Devereaux goes out to check on his mother and father, and they're fine, they're hugging, and so on and so forth. And so we have it to where that's really just the end of the movie. We really have it to where we would assume that Veronica had done a report on all this, and like these people who are left to have been involved in this thing have gotten the time that they deserved, so on and so forth. But then again, sequels. So, yeah, so really, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. It took an hour and whatever to talk about it. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.